I have some fantastic opportunities in my life, but there's probably a couple over the last few years which have been very notable. And they have some commonality as well. One was when I took over as CEO in the UK and Ireland a few years ago now, and I looked out to an audience of a few thousand individuals in Cisco and thought, they're all sitting waiting for me to inspire them in some way. And then there was last August, as was said, where I stood in front of a very short beach, looking out over a lake, wearing GB colours and my name and GBR on the front, and saying, wow, I've got to go out here. There was all different countries, another 100 or so guys at either side of me about to start. And the commonality, to be honest, with both of them was, I said in both cases, what the hell am I doing here? I mean, genuinely, I thought, what the hell am I doing here? But in reality, those kinds of experiences, that ability to do something very, very different, alongside maybe you do something you do eventually every day, is very, very powerful counterpoint and something that I think I've learned an enormous amount from. Now, triathlon's a great sport for doing analogies. I mean, there are some fantastic analogies in every business presentation I can do to talk about triathlon, and there's a lot to learn from it, because it is an amazing sport. I mean, it's 3 sports in one, so you get a chance to do it. It's the fastest growing sport in Britain. It's a really interesting thing to do. However, it takes a bit of time and effort to get round to doing it properly. Because actually, if you think about it, you've got to do 3 different things. That's kind of an interesting analogy when you're in business, to think, I actually don't have to just do one thing. I actually have to keep changing and finding how I modify myself, how I change behavior, how I manage people differently, and so on. But you think about the first discipline. The first discipline is swimming. Okay, so you have to swim, and that's the one that scares most people, to be quite honest. We all think, I could probably do a triathlon as long as I didn't have to do the swimming. But the swimming's quite tough, because what they do particularly if you start in the way you did in Edmonton, which we're all standing on a beach, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 feet in front of you, and then you kind of run and dive into the water. And so for the first, 50, 60 meters or so, it's what they call the washing machine. And genuinely, it is like a washing machine. There's people under you, there's people on top of you, you're trying to swim, you're trying to breathe, you're trying to find your way forward, you're trying to find a bit of open water. You find some clarity in quite difficult conditions, which isn't all that different from most of us in business these days, where we're actually trying to find, in a crowded environment, some way forward for our business. How do we distinguish ourselves? How do we find something different? It's actually pretty tricky. And then, of course, you move on to the bike. You get on the bike and you think, right, leap onto that. You shoot off on the bike. You're pedaling away like crazy. And, of course, in that case, you're relying on the machinery. You're relying on this amazing piece of technology that you have under you to get you across the 20 or 40 kilometers of your race for the next phase of it. And, of course, relying on that machinery is a pretty special thing. And, of course, being a guy, I like to buy some of this technology. In fact, there's a great T-shirt I saw recently for triathletes and cyclists that basically says, my biggest fear that is when I die, my wife might sell my bikes for how much I told her they cost. So there is really clearly a great opportunity to use the technology and use the machinery around you. And actually, that's very powerful in business as well. The most successful people I see in business today, the most successful leaders I see in business today, are people who know how to use resources. Any entrepreneur you'll talk to is an absolute master at using every tool, every person, every facility, every opportunity he or she can do. And you really need to think about that when you're in business. And if you're on a bike in a triathlon, you will use every opportunity you have, and every piece of carbon, every piece of bars, every gadget you can possibly, electronic gears, everything. It makes probably no difference at all to my performance, but it makes me feel better. But genuinely in business, that use of other resources, and in today's world where resources are spread all over the world, the last thing you want to do is to say, I'll use my little team here and I'm not going to use anybody else. Would be an absolutely crazy thing to do. And then, of course, you move on to the run. And the run, of course, is pretty exciting. It's pretty much survival for most of us to get through to the end. And of course, there's a lot we can learn from that. There's no point in just starting something and never finishing. You've got to keep on. You've got to run over the tops of hills. You've got to get to the other side. You've got to finish. And actually, in triathlons, if you're actually pretty nerdy, you then actually start to focus on the bits in between, what they call the transitions, and how you change in between them. And it does get quite nerdy because, you clip your shoes into the bike and you attach them with elastic bands to the wheels and you jump on and break the elastic bands and you have elastic laces in your shoes so that you save yourself 10 seconds here or there. But again, it's thinking about how you adapt, how you perform in what's a very, very different world. Now, those analogies are all interesting, but it wasn't actually what I wanted to say, because actually I think the real beauty of triathlon, in my eyes, when I think about it from business, is it makes me think about things in threes. And I think business is really complicated nowadays. There's an awful lot to do, and it's changing very, very fast. And so I'd say the three things that you really need to think about is business is changing. It's getting very different than it was just a few years ago. And I think the nature of business and how we do business is changing. I think people are changing. And I think change is changing. And if we think about that overall from a business perspective, if I look at many businesses, when I've grown up through business, it was all about performance. You've got to do this. You've got to make the number. You've got to do whatever you're doing. And I'm not saying that's not important. Most businesses have a purpose, whether that be a profit purpose or a social purpose or a service purpose of some sort. But ultimately, business is much more important than that now. And if you look at the sorts of things we focus on, and it's a great parallel for triathlon as well, is that actually the health of the business is extremely important. How many businesses did we see over the last few years, the Woolworths and maybe even more recently, challenges with some of the other retailers, that actually the underlying health wasn't that great? And if you don't focus on the underlying health of a business and how your people are performing and the way they're doing business, you're ultimately going to fail. That's exactly the same. Probably all of you could do a triathlon. All of you could do it. Now, would you feel very well afterwards? Probably not, if you've not done very much. But if you trained and got your basic health in place, you could do that. And that's absolutely true of business. But it's much, much more sustainable if you work on the health of your business. Being healthy, making sure that you actually perform consistently well, not just for now, but for the future. Because it is changing, and many of my colleagues in industry that I talk to are much more focused on the health of their business now. And hopefully from that, they deliver the performance. It's a definite change in focus. The second thing is people are changing. The expectations are different. We talk a lot about Gen Y, Gen Z coming along. I often sit down with a number of folks in my organization, and I talk to them about what they're doing in business. But I particularly like to sit down with the graduates or the interns or the folks on work experience. And I sat down with last year's graduates, and I said, "Okay, have you got any questions?" And the very first question I got from one of the graduates was, "How are you going to keep me here in 3 years' time?" Now, when I joined the job, it's like, "Thank you for the job. I really appreciate it. How are you going to keep me in 3 years' time?" And I think, wow, that's an interesting reflection, because he's basically saying, I see my life panning out probably as a series of jobs, my skill taken to different places. How are you going to actually persuade me to stay here? Not in a nasty way. He was just saying, I see that's it. You need to do something that's going to help me take the next stage in what I want to do. That's a very different way of thinking, I think. And I think it's important now that chief execs and people who are thinking about business are thinking about the people in their business, because believe me, the next 20 years and beyond, but for the next 20 years, the battle in business is going to be the battle for talent. If you don't have the best talent, the best people who genuinely are motivated to make you successful, you will fail. And, we see that all the time. And I'm delighted, the things I really feel give me most pleasure is, when we do things like our employee satisfaction survey, we got 100% of people who were proud to work for Cisco. That was a much better figure than me, than knowing that we were performing well or growing well and so on. It meant that I had some real health inside the business, and people were reacting to what we were doing inside the business. So a healthy environment, that people are definitely changing. And I think it's important that you recognize that those changes are things that you have to react to. And I think having an opportunity for people to see you as a leader, or you as a business person, or you in a company, as someone that's human rather than someone that just drives for numbers is incredibly important. I think people relating to you, I have more feedback from my employees when I write a blog or send out a tweet or whatever, talking about some of the things I'm doing. You know, I had a problem, had to go and see somebody in the family, do whatever. I get more feedback than I do than that on something to do with business performance. People want to gain some kind of bond with someone who they work for. They want to understand what that really means. I think that's incredibly important. And you do get examples where there are many people who are in that kind of environment. You think, actually, having something else, maybe triathlon isn't their thing, but I've got people who are opera singers or, you know, who do basket weaving or whatever they do, but they want to see someone that's maybe a bit more human, maybe someone that actually they can relate to. And I think the leaders of the future will be people that people in their organization can genuinely relate to and feel that they can have a relationship with is much more open. I mean, I meet some amazing people in my role, and a very short diversion for someone I met who I'm not sure I could entirely relate to. I was speaking at the very first Silicon Valley Comes to Oxford, which I think many of you probably know about. And in Silicon Valley Comes to Oxford, I was one of the speakers on the panel, and I went up. There's a load of really amazing people there, you know, Google founders and eBay founders and so on. And there was a guy standing in the corner. The rest of the speakers were chatting to the dean. There was a guy standing over there, and I walked up to this guy. I said, "Oh, hi, I'm Phil Smith from Cisco." He said, "Oh, yeah." He introduced himself, and I said, "Oh, you from Silicon Valley?" He said, "I'm actually from LA." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." I said, "I thought it was Silicon Valley." He said, "Yeah, I used to be in Silicon Valley, but I moved to LA for space." And I went, "Okay, is there more space in LA? I thought there was more space in Silicon Valley." He said, no, space. And genuinely, the next thing he said to me, he said, "I'm building a rocket ship to go to Mars." I went, "Really?" And so I was slightly backed away as I was talking to him, and I said, no. I said, "Well, how did you get there?" And he said, "Well, when I was in my teens, I set up a company called Zip2 that I sold to HP for $340 million. Then I set up PayPal, which I sold to eBay for $3 billion. And then, of course, this was Elon Musk. So, of course, he started saying, oh, yeah, then I set up Tesla, and I set up SpaceX, and blah, blah, blah." So, you know, maybe he's not the perfect example of someone you could relate to in your business, but he was an interesting character nonetheless, and someone you might want to meet sometime. He's actually the guy, you know, they based the Iron Man, the Robert Downey Jr. character, on him. So, interesting guy. So, anyway, so in the, you know, in business, I think importantly, you know, we've got those big changes going on. Business is changing itself. I think the people are changing, but I think also the change is changing itself. I think we're having to change much more frequently than we ever have before. If you think things are staying still, forget it. You know, that certainly relates to me in my sporting exploits. You know, literally every week there's some new gadget that I have to buy to be able to try and make me go slightly faster, or some piece of training advice or whatever. But in business, everything is changing so quickly. And a lot of it's been driven by technology. And there's no doubt about it, if you look today at the sorts of changes that are happening to business model, there is no company now around which doesn't have some challenge where they either have to disrupt their market or they're going to be disrupted. We know great examples, of course, that are very current at the moment with Uber and Airbnb and so on. But they're continually challenging, they're absolutely changing the rules. And I think it's fundamentally important that we recognize that if you're going to change the rules, you have to be on the front foot. You have to be the one that's leading. So, you know, everything is changing. And I think those three are probably the most important. You know, people are changing, business is changing, and change itself is changing at a much greater rate. And I think every business today has to think about the impact that technology and digitization, in fact, of companies is actually having on them. So fundamentally, I think there are a lot of advantages for someone like me trying to sometimes break away from the day of actually having to run a business, which obviously keeps you fairly busy, to actually do something else that other people can relate to do something that gives you a little bit of a stretch, to do something that makes you think simply maybe about 3 things you should do every day. And overall, I think, you know, inspired by a day like today when we're talking at TEDx, I think there's the opportunity for everybody to do something fundamentally different. So thank you very much.